Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Christian Watson, who has been so kind as to answer a few questions about philosophy for us today. So I would like to let Christian introduce himself a little more. Go ahead.
Well, thank you so much for having me, man. I appreciate your enthusiastic interest in my work. Whenever anyone's interested in my work, I'm very humbled because for me, my work is not necessarily just something to gratify myself. It's an experiment in how we can ultimately be better people, how we can ultimately have better and smarter and more just systems. And so I'm profoundly honored. I appreciate it. And yeah, so I'm Christian. I basically do political commentary with a tinge of philosophy on YouTube. I'm trying to become a public intellectual. I think I have a very dynamic way of looking at things, especially compared to most political talkers today who want to stay on the surface and who don't want to really go beyond what appears to be immediately evident, the sort of prima facie effect, I call it. And so I hope that I'll be able to explore some of those ideas with you guys here tonight.
Yeah, so I just wanted to mention that I have noticed that you have a personality. You're not like a stuffy academic, and I feel like academia is kind of just filled with pretentious people. Is
Yes.
that maybe somewhat accurate?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
So let me give you an example. And I don't want to be unfair to the academics who are just really into it for the ideas who do not necessarily use their knowledge or use their prestige or their sort of vain approbations being in the form of their PhDs or whatever to I don't want to be unfair to all of them. Some of them are very, very nice people who simply want to make sure that people have a good understanding of their subject matter. But unfortunately, an overwhelming majority are not that way. I think that overwhelming majority of academics are a little bit too conceited and to see beyond their own nonsense. And I think that this is not forget PhDs. I think this illness infects even the most fledgling of academic minds. So, for example, I before I did my YouTube thing, I used to write a lot, and in the writing world, and writing is obviously a key feature of academia. And in the writing world, especially the academic writing world, where people write in academic prose for mainstream publications, or not mainstream, but popular publications like Ariel Magazine, Quillette, City Journal. When people write in academic prose for those publications, a lot of them will join a clique, and they will presume that if you do not write for those publications, what you have to say is less valuable. And unfortunately, I first of all, I don't even write that much to begin with. Outside of university, I really just do my video stuff. So automatically, I'm excluded from their circles of validation. And so I have experienced firsthand from my fellow peers the sort of consequences of this kind of pretension that seeps into almost every level of society and academia. So yeah, it's true. It's not just a stereotype. It's true.
And just a little history question about you. You're currently studying philosophy, or have you graduated yet? Where are you at on that timeline?
I'm currently studying philosophy. I'm in my third year of university. Yes, sir.
Okay. Um, I had noticed that, or I had watched your recent video with James Lindsay, and you two have a really
Yes.
good back and forth. You're just both so brilliant,
Thank you.
and you play off each other really well. And you hit something on the head that I have just been feeling and thinking a lot about lately, where you mentioned that there's a lot of anger and hatred sort of fueling the social justice warrior rise in activism. And I feel like that anger and hatred also is what fueled Trumpism. I feel like it's kind of fueling radicalism in general. But I'm more concerned, I would say, about the intersectional side than I am the Trump side.
Hmm.
And so, how has it just risen so quickly to have taken over our institutions? It feels like
Yeah, and a word about the Trump thing, right? A word about the Trump thing.
absolutely.
I don't. Oh dear, did I? Oh, hold on. I think I disconnected. Did I disconnect?
No,
Okay,
I
sorry, my internet is very spotty. Excuse me.
no, no worries.
Excuse me. Okay, sorry. Okay, okay. Um, So yeah, just a word about the Trump thing. So I want to be a little bit fair. I don't think everyone who supported Trump has the mentality of a cult member. I think there are people who supported the president because the president stood as a sort of archetypal repudiation to a lot of the status quo, and the status quo was seen as a bad thing. Now, of course, there is danger in supporting someone solely because you are angry. I think that anger is not the best state in which human beings make rational decisions. But I do think there are people who do support President Trump, former President Trump, who are not necessarily cult members, so to speak, or have a rabid mindset. But I do think, regardless, I do agree with you. The intersectional side is much more dangerous than any political figure could muster up, because political figures a lot of times they have these ideas, and when they pass away, these ideas tend to pass away, or they mutate and go to a different form. For example, Huey Long in Louisiana in the 30s and 20s, he had a lot of different ideas that were, the typical kind of progressive kind of stuff, typical kind of communist kind of stuff. But, he had a Pacific flavor of those ideas embedded in Louisiana politics. He died, got shot, and his style of politics kind of died with him, even if the abstract ideas behind them kind of went over to a different source. The danger with wokeism is that it's entirely an abstract idea, right? It's not attached to a single figure. It's an abstract idea that is taking hold in the material world, which kind of insulates it from the sort of proper laws of, let's say, political gravitation and institutional gravitation, which would dictate. So all it means is simply how we do things in society, how certain things happen, and those laws would dictate the longevity of certain ideas. They would critique certain ideas. I mean, you don't think there's a single boardroom in America where someone hasn't had an idea thrown out. But when these ideas are accepted as a given, because they communicate values that we think we have, or that we think are good, then it kind of insulates them from that sort of law of institutional gravitation, where the ideas can be engaged with in an honest way, in a critical way. Because if you criticize the idea of anti-racism, someone could deduce, especially if they're endorsing Kendi's paradigm. And funnily enough, I just got done reading some Kendi, actually. And he basically says there's no such thing as a not racist idea. There's no such thing as a non-racist idea. There's no such thing as race neutrality. Kendi says that everything is either racist or anti-racist. No, and, if, or between. That's what he says in chapter 2 of his book, which is titled Definitions, I think. So, sorry, go on. Sorry.
No, is that Ibram X. Kennedy that you're
Yes,
referencing?
absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely,
I've heard
absolutely.
that name thrown around.
Yes.
And so I just wanted, man, you just said so much there.
Yeah.
There are so many words now to be associated with, like communism, socialism, Leninism, Stalinism, Marxism.
Yeah.
There's all these words, and the wokeism kind of uses them all to its advantage. It's like this monster
Right.
that will use whatever it can to amass power. So what's like
Right.
an umbrella term that moving forward we can try to best use when talking about this? I guess, is intersectionality a good umbrella term?
Sorry. Say it again.
Oh, okay. I'm just trying to
Say it again. Sorry.
can you hear me now?
I heard the tail end of that. Intersection now.
Oh,
Yeah.
is that maybe an
Yes.
appropriate word
Yes.
we can try to use as like an umbrella term? I guess I'm just really concerned about this rise. It feels like 10 years ago, I would have laughed if you said communism was on the rise. And now I look around and I'm like, what is going on in our country? So I guess, like, what's the best
Right.
attack,
Right.
point of attack? There we go. That we can try to muster.
Right. Right. Well, so I don't think that using these terms in their fullest sense does justice to what wokeism actually is. I don't think the wokeites are communist or just communists. They have communistic influences, but they also have influences from ideologies that are critical of communism, as those ideologies are critical of any modernity belief. I think that there's not really one single catch-all term to define the beliefs of all the woke. I do think that there is an underlying foundation, however, and the underlying foundation is the critical race theory stuff. And for example, Herbert Marcuse, I was reading some with him today. He basically laid down the foundations for what we call cancel culture today, because Marcuse is very much against the sort of libertarian Western liberal idea of toleration. He was very critical of that idea, and Marcuse was a Marxist philosopher, but he was also, he's a descendant of the Frankfurt School, and those guys, their entire project was to critique and pick apart modernity. It was to critique and pick apart some of the primary institutional values and ideological values of Western modernity. And so I don't think there's a catch-all term, but I do think that you could probably get away with referring to wokeness as a sort of critical belief, not critical in the sense that it is being exegetical, but critical in the sense that it is relating to critical race theory. Exegetical simply means that it is they are looking at a issue for what it is and analyzing it like that. But wokeness is not that. Critical race theory is not that. It is entirely what we call an eisegetical process, which simply means that you're reading your interpretation into a various amount of issues. So if I'm being eisegetical about something, I could take an author's work and look at his work or her work and say, okay, this is what he's saying, and because I think this way. An exegetical process is like, oh, no, no, no. Okay, this is what he's saying based on the context clues in his own words. Wokeness is entirely exegetical. Entirely. I mean, because they read these qualities and values into things. They read, for example, Kendi reads racism into every single thing. He attacks the Reagan Revolution. He attacks voter ID laws. He attacks all these things, which may or may not be concerned with race at all, but he casts them as entirely racially based issues and gives you no other context. And so that's what a lot of the woke people do. That's what a lot of the critical theorists do. They don't care about context. They care about having their ideology and reading that into the various disciplines and subjects of the world. So there's not really a catch-all term, but I do think that you could say that most woke ideologies are critical.
Okay, so like just, and I've heard woke is now being disparaged, and I think that's appropriate. So wokeism might be the best point of attack.
Yeah, you could say that. You could say that. Although that kind of conjures the image of this enlightened young person, marching in the streets, and there are some people who are quote unquote woke who are everything but that, who are people who are much older, who have a lot of knowledge behind their assertions, even if that knowledge is not good knowledge, it's knowledge nonetheless, which can make them seem compelling to laymen or really anyone, even people who may disagree. So maybe wokeism, but here's what I say. I say we just look at the case by case basis of how these things manifest and we handle them in that way and we identify them with their closest ideological cousin. So if we see a woke person using a lot of postmodern lingo, we can probably say, okay, maybe they're a postmodernist. If we see a lot of a woke person talking about class conflict and Marxism and using that as a mechanism by which they want to evaluate the world, okay, they're probably like a neo-Marxist, something like that. But again, the terminology doesn't matter. Understanding matters. And I think that you can better understand people and their motivations without binding them to a category, because categories are actually the tool used by a lot of woke theorists, a lot of critical race theorists, to bind our understanding of the world towards a unidirectional pathway. So I think that the categories themselves may be not the way to go overall. Independently in small circumstances, sure, why not? Why not? But overall, I'm not so sure.
Okay. You mentioned how these abstract ideas have somehow permeated into the material world.
Mm-hmm.
How I see it almost is the immense appeal to emotional arguments.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
it
Mm-hmm.
seems like that's just getting it's increasing at an alarming rate.
Right.
There's no conversation around facts and data. If
Mm-hmm.
accurate facts and data can be made available. I know it's
Mhm.
controversial to talk about certain statistics nowadays. Um,
Mhm.
so, how do we fight an emotional enemy? Or how do we
Mm.
win these battles where you're seen as a heartless or soulless person for trying to go against the narrative? And that affects me personally because, like, I'm so full of love, but I'm also so full of anger, and just
Mhm.
these times are so troubling.
Mhm.
Um,
Well, I think Pascal said that to tell someone they're wrong, you have to first tell them why they're right. Now, if you think that the woke stuff is not right, which I don't think it's right, you can probably still identify certain issues within the woke category that you can say, I may be able to break bread with you on this particular matter. For example, a lot of the woke people are concerned about police brutality. Okay, well, I think police brutality is a big issue. But the bit difference between me and a woke person is I don't think police brutality is a race issue. I think police brutality is an issue of a perverse mentality, of abuse, of anger that permeates in so many of the minds of the oftentimes undereducated police force that we have in this country. I mean, when you have departments, at least one department, I think, turning away people who score high enough on an IQ test from being officers, you obviously have a mentality that values a certain level of understanding. So I think that you break bread on specific issues because really the issue of fighting wokeness is an issue entirely of first principles, an issue entirely of first principles. Because if they view the world as the consummate sum of oppressive systems, that's an issue of first principles. If I view the world as the consummate sum of a variety of objective facts which exist in a reality that I can ascertain through observation, I can filter my assertions, my observations, excuse me, through my faculty of reason. Zeria would say the light of reason, as Descartes would say. If I can do that, and that's my paradigm. Obviously, I'm going to differ from someone who thinks that the world is simply the consummate sum of power and political systems just banging against each other. So the first principles battle is where people get caught up at. And that's fine. That's where my fight mostly is, actually, by the way. But if you want to make a practical effect, you're going to have to look at the independent issues, irregardless of first principles, and talk about those issues as they materially are. And I think the woke like to use data. They use data when it ostensibly suits them. When they can say, okay, X many black boys or black guys are shot, or X many black people are in prison. And, when they talk about mass incarceration or police brutality, um, they they love using all kinds of data. So it's not that they entirely avoid empiricism. That's not the entire case.
just when it
It's not that they entirely avoid empiricism.
and so
Yeah. It's not that they entirely avoid empiricism. Sorry, go on.
no, you're so right, and because I agree with a lot of the problems that the social justice warriors are bringing up. I agree, but I just their solutions, as you've mentioned, how they're making everything or viewing everything through that race lens and that systemic oppression lens.
Mm-hmm.
It's off-putting, and they talk about allyship and unity while simultaneously trying to push away 60% of the population in the form of demonizing whiteness.
Mm-hmm.
You are Do you have like a philosophical or political framework that you subscribe to, or are you just
Yes.
yes, okay. What would that
Yes,
be?
I am a natural rights theory libertarian, meaning that
Okay.
I believe that human beings are endowed with sort of divine rights. I think Locke's articulation of these rights is probably the best. Although Locke got his articulation from two other theorists that I think are worth studying as well. They're oftentimes quite underrated: Hugo Grotius, who and Samuel von Pufendorf. Hugo Grotius is considered to be the father of modern day natural law theory. Pufendorf was also a natural law theorist, although Pufendorf had more of a communitarian perspective. Pufendorf actually posed a interesting state of nature theory that contrasted with Hobbes. But for Pufendorf, the individual is not what matters as much as the wealth and health of the community. But there are, the natural law theorists kind of cultivated a strong sense for the individual to have a foundation in freedom. Grotius certainly did. And so, but anyway, Locke articulated this as life, liberty, and possessions. Those are the three things that we have access to. Now, I personally believe that life, liberty, and possessions are simply the manifestations of an overall order of who we are as human beings. I think liberty is first and foremost a sort of ontological reality. Simply meaning that I think liberty is something that is inherent, integral to our very being, our very physiology. Now, of course, this perspective requires free will. In my personal opinion, I think Locke would disagree, but I think that it does require free will, or at least an admission that free will is possible, because if it's not, then I don't think it's really liberty. But I also think that this idea of liberty is kind of supported by the law of non-contradiction, because any action you take is ultimately, according to libertarian paradigm, an action that you're taking under the auspices of you having liberty. Even if you were, quote unquote, coerced to take that action, you still took the action. You still used agency. You still took the action. I mean, Hannah Arendt, she says that, I don't care if you were coerced or forced into putting all of those Jewish people into concentration camps. You had a choice. And even if the choice was to die, you still had a choice. You still had a choice to eschew evil, but you chose not to do it. That is, I think that's, even though Hannah Arendt was no libertarian, she was no libertarian whatsoever. I don't want to cast her as that. She was no libertarian. But that viewpoint kind of encapsulates the sort of ontological foundations of a proper understanding, in my opinion, of natural law and natural rights theory. So that's the viewpoint that I subscribe to.
The divine portion of that, is that sort of, that's not a God divine, that's just sort of like a divine meaning in life, or is it deriving
Exactly.
from okay.
Well, so I ultimately do not think that you can have natural rights there without having a deity. That's my personal opinion, but I do think there is a secular justification for natural rights there. I think that we can ascertain that we have these things through reason. You cannot believe in a God and still have your liberty, right? You cannot believe in a God and still have your ability, your agency to act, your agency, and your right not to be interfered with. But I do think that if you're going to have a metaphysical foundation for this idea, it best requires a deity. It doesn't have to have it. Again, Grotius said that even if the most profane thing were to be true, that there was no God, this theory still stands up. And he actually wrote an entire book on the law of war and peace about his theory, Grotius being a Christian, his theory being entirely secularly justified. So no, you don't have to have a God. I think that it's helpful. I think that it's kind of necessary, but you don't have to.
That is such a beautiful answer, because it covers everyone.
Right.
It's really funny that you brought this up, because I wanted to title this video "Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness" with Christian Watson. I had overheard in a previous video your libertarian leaning, and just those are really good values to strive for. You said one other thing about sort of free will and agency. I consider myself a conspiracy realist. I am very skeptical of the government. I'm very skeptical of our institutions, of our ruling class at this point. And I remember 10 years ago, people used to joke about like being brainwashed. Oh, that person's brainwashed. And it was like edgy and funny and whatever. But now it literally feels like people are brainwashed. And I question if they have agency of mind at that point. And how do we continue as a culture if people, and maybe this is the conversation we need to have humans had agency of mind ever? Or
by agency of mind, do you simply mean the ability to consciously make decisions?
Without malevolent interference. That's kind of where I'm coming from. If know someone's being inundated with propaganda, are they actually able to make, well, so they're still making their own decisions, but do they have free will at that point?
Of course they do. So here's what I think. I think you raise a very important point, though. We can only work with the concepts that we have. I can only understand the world through the concepts that are at my fingertips. If I had never read Locke or Grotius or the internet about natural law theory, I wouldn't be able to articulate it as I just did with you right now. That doesn't make natural law theory any less true. It just makes my access to natural law theory hidden. Similarly, if I am not going to use my agency in a way to protect myself from untruth, doesn't mean my agency is any less true. It is that my agency is not being used as it should be used. It's not being utilized at all. So yeah, I think we have agency of mind, as you put it. I just don't think that everyone uses it as well as they should.
That was just the perfect distinction, is because you have it, it's just people don't use it.
Exactly. A
But
lot of
thank
people
you.
don't use it. Yeah.
Sorry.
Not to be insulting, but a lot of folks don't use it, unfortunately.
It's a conversation that needs to happen.
Yeah.
We're running low on time, so I'll just ask kind of sort of the quick wrap up question. You're just doing, this is fantastic work. I'm thankful that you're
Thank you.
sharing this time with me and informing me and doing your
I will
YouTube.
come back. I will
I
come
look
back for a
forward to it.
longer for a longer conversation. I will come back. Yes, absolutely.
I'll be very much more prepared. What do you do to unwind? Do you have anything right now?
um, I'm kind of ashamed to admit this. I like watching Netflix sometimes. Netflix is fun sometimes.
There,
There's some what?
there's no shame in that. You're so well read. I'm embarrassed because I'm like, I have
No,
so many names to go look up now.
I'm not as well read as you think. Trust me. My knowledge is very specialized, and I stick in that field. You know, so uh, but yeah, Netflix is fun. Sometimes I like I like interactive storytelling where two people sit there and we both write up a story at the same time. It's colloquially called role playing these days, I guess, but I call it interactive storytelling because you're creating a story with someone right there and just doing it for fun. I like doing that. I like watching documentaries, stuff like that. I like listening to music. I'm a big fan of classic rock. Big fan of classic rock stuff. Um,
Okay. Um,
yeah,
that's awesome. That I think that's a good little place to end it on a lighter note. I'm gonna
yeah.
go ahead and I'll just hit stop recording if I
Okay.
can.